In this next lesson on 1 Corinthians, we will consider chapters 3 and 4. In the last lesson, Paul had warned the Corinthian believers against forming factions and cliques within the church. In this section, he will warn them against exalting other people. It was an inevitable consequence of forming divisions that the leader they followed would be bigged up. After all, they were hardly likely to form a grouping around someone of no reputation. In this day of celebrity and the cult of the persona, this is a timely reminder for us. How many divisions within the church have occurred, with the adherents taking on the name of a leading light? How many doctrines are associated with the name of an individual? How many gospel campaigns or teaching weeks advertise the evangelist or teacher? What matters is the word of God. In the first 4 verses, Paul takes his readers to task as those who are carnal. In the previous chapters, he had contrasted those who were spiritual, saved, against those who are natural, unsaved. Now, Paul contrasts those who are spiritual, maturing and growing as Christians, against those who are carnal, immature in the faith and worldly in outlook. Paul had been with them for 18 months, and now, about 3 years later, he is writing to them. In that time, some of them had hardly grown spiritually as a Christian. Their lives were largely characterized by their old nature. So they were forming parties within the church around a human leader. That is what the unbeliever does. It should not happen in the church. In verses 5 to 8, Paul gives the reason for this. To spare the sensitivities of those in Corinth, he does not name the individuals who are being lauded as leaders. Instead, he uses himself and Apollos as examples to show how foolish they were being. Paul gives 2 reasons why it was madness to divide on sectarian grounds. Firstly, Paul and Apollos were both servants, and nobody forms a noble society based on servants. For example, we speak of the Thatcher government or the Blair government, but who remembers the names of the civil servants who enacted their policies? The second reason is that both Paul and Apollos were engaged in the same work. One was planting, another watering, but the crop, the harvest, was the same. Both had vital roles to play, but it was all to the same goal, a bountiful crop. The implication was that if others were not a part of this one work, then they were not engaged in serving the Lord. The next section, in verses 9 to 17, make the fact that everything that goes on within the church should be a part of serving the Lord abundantly clear. Each one of us is responsible to God in terms of our service and behaviour as members of his church. From Pentecost until the return of the Lord, each believer is a fellow worker engaged in God's building project. We work together to accomplish his purposes. Service within the church is not a competition, but a collaboration. Christ and the apostles have laid the foundation, and it is upon this that we subsequently build. Now, I know enough about architecture to know that if I start building a part of the building that is not resting foursquare upon the foundations beneath, then it is not going to end well. It may look good initially, but before long the cracks will appear and the superstructure will inevitably crumble. Paul then writes that it is not just where we build upon the foundation truths given by Christ and the apostles, it is also a matter of how we build. Paul gives 3 examples of costly building materials: gold, silver and precious stones. In this context, probably marble or alabaster, etc., rather than diamonds and rubies. These would equate to service done for Christ in a God-honouring way and in obedience to his calling. Sadly, Paul also gives 3 examples of impoverished building materials: wood, hay, stubble. These would equate to service done from wrong motives and that had not been given to the individual from the Lord. In the immediate context of the Corinthian church, wrong teaching that was not in full accord with what Paul had himself been teaching them was probably in view. This is no less a problem in the 21st century as it was in the first. There is a day to come when every servant's work will be judged. Those who have faithfully served the Lord in humble obedience will receive a reward, verse 14. Their work is spoken about as enduring. Those whose servant has sprung from self will see their work burned up, though they themselves are saved. This evaluation of a life of service will take place at the judgment seat of Christ, the Bema. See also 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. Now this is not a time when sin will be judged. As believers, we have been frankly forgiven. However, it is a time when service is assessed. That which is done for Christ will last. That which is not will be destroyed. I may have taught Sunday school for years, but if it was only done to gain me an audience and influence in my local church, then it will be burned up, worthless. Imagine standing before the Lord with nothing, no chance to make amends. As an individual, I need to challenge myself as to what I'm likely to have in that day. As a husband, I say I love my wife, but what do I do now that enables her to have something for that day? As a father, do I encourage my children to live their lives, make their career choices, etc., in view of that day? These things are serious and they really matter. They matter because we are the dwelling place of God now, and He is holy. Dare I introduce the common, the worthless, into His temple, the church? Verses 18 to 23 show that the one who lives their life for that coming day may well appear foolish and weak by the judgment standards of this world. So be it. True wisdom comes in recognizing that we have been given all that we need to honour God now. All we do, all we give to Him, came from Him, and so there is no room for boasting or personal pride. We all belong to Christ alone, and this is how Paul expected the Corinthians to live together. The first 5 verses of chapter 4 flow out of the truth that all things belong to Christ. Paul wanted the Corinthians to recognise that he and any others that were being claimed as leaders were stewards in God's house. A steward looked after the person and the property of their master. It was essential that they acted as a faithful servant, since all that they handled belonged to the master. To make bad investments, to lose the money or resources of the master, would impoverish the master and risk reputational damage. Paul specifies of what in particular they were stewards: the mysteries of God. Truth that had previously been hidden but had now been revealed to the apostles was in view. Time here does not allow an in-depth study of this, but a careful reading of the following scriptures is to be encouraged. Matthew 13:11, Romans 11:25, 1 Corinthians 15:51, Ephesians 1:9, 3:6 and 5:32 and 6:19, Colossians 1:27, 2 Thessalonians 2:7, 1 Timothy 3:9 and 16, Revelation 1:20, 10:7 and 17 verse 5. Now it did not matter what the other servants thought of the steward. The only opinion that mattered was the master's. So Paul writes that we should not judge the service of others or even ourselves. We can only do so based upon incomplete information and partial knowledge. Assessment of our service must be left to the Lord, who will judge all correctly and reward accordingly. Verses 6 to 13 challenge the Corinthians as to the matter of pride. They were proud of the faction they followed. They were proud of the leader of that group. But pride is sinful and foolish. Not only does everything we have come to us as the gift of God, not only does any outcome of our service depend entirely upon His blessing of a work, but pride leads us to a premature seeking of a position now. Christ now is rejected by this world, awaiting the day when He will be acknowledged as King of Kings. The apostles were considered as worthless by the world. What fool would give their life for a dead man? They were the scum and refuses of decent society. How inappropriate then that the Corinthians should want a name and a position in the society in which they lived. There is a day when we shall reign with Him, but that day is not yet. As their spiritual father, Paul concludes the chapter evidencing the love that he had for his spiritual children. He was to send Timothy to them so that he could get first-hand knowledge of their true condition. Things would have to change. If the Lord allowed, he would come himself. The manner of his coming would depend upon the Corinthians themselves. If they repented and put right the problems that existed, then he would come in a spirit of gentleness. If they did not, then he would come with the rod of correction. Sin cannot be allowed to continue for fear of confrontation. The church is the temple of God, and His holiness really does matter.